some of the big challenges facing the government and therefore the civil service at the moment, and then maybe make a few observations about the civil service reform programme 1 year on, and leave plenty of time for questions, because I think that's often the most sort of interesting bit of these sorts of talks. So, what's in my in tray? What is the government worrying about? We haven't got time to do justice to all the foreign policy issues, the terrorism issues, the extremism questions, the big debate about the future of the United Kingdom. I thought I would just home in on 3 big domestic policy challenges which really are and were last year and still are this year dominating the Prime Minister's in tray, the Deputy Prime Minister's in tray, and therefore our collective in tray, if you want to put it like that. The first, and by far and away the most sort of the highest profile in the Prime Minister's mind, is the economy. Those of you here last year probably heard me say this before, but it bears repeating. It's absolutely the #1 priority of the government to get the UK economy moving again. In recent weeks and months, I think it's fair to say there have been some quite promising signs. To some extent, the GDP figures are looking a little bit better. Business surveys are showing a little bit more optimism. The housing market is warming up a little bit. But there's a very, very long way to go. We were reminded only last week by some revised economic numbers that the economy as a whole remains about 4% smaller in size than it was in 2008. So 5 years on from the trough of the recession, we still haven't anywhere near recovered all of the output lost in that terribly deep recession we suffered at the end of 2007, beginning of 2008. So those are really daunting numbers and just show the size of the challenge. It's not all bad, of course. Some quite remarkable things have happened in the economy over the last 5 years. Private sector employment has increased by more than 1 million. The number of new businesses created is about 1.5 million over the last 3 years, which is a remarkable figure given how weak the GDP numbers have been. So it's not all bad, but the size of the challenge is, I think, evident for all to see. And it's not just about the overall amount of activity in the economy. The government has been very, very clear from the outset it wants to see a rebalanced UK economy. So less reliance on consumption growth fueled by debt, much more focus on investment and net exports. A geographic rebalancing as well, away from the southeast of England and London as being the most prosperous parts. Of course, we want to see prosperity continuing here, but we need to see that rebalanced across the whole of the United Kingdom, so that even the most deprived parts of the country see prosperity. And a sectoral rebalancing away from a focus on financial services and professional services more generally, a revival of manufacturing. Much easier said than done. Clearly not a 2-year project, a 5-year project. This is a 10-year project, a 20-year generational battle to rebalance the economy in ways that we haven't seen for many, many decades. So that is a daunting task ahead. And as a result of the sort of centrality of that to the government's agenda, the Prime Minister has made it clear that he wants every single permanent secretary in Whitehall to have an economic growth objective as part of their personal objectives. These are all published now on the web, so you can see what permanent secretaries are going to get judged against. So every permanent secretary to have a growth objective, and every department must, in one form or another, contribute to the growth agenda. So next week in Cabinet, we'll have, I think, the Ministry of Justice coming to make their presentation. We've had presentations from the Ministry of Defence, from the Department for Energy and Climate Change. Every department has to come forward to Cabinet and produce its best ideas as to how it's contributing to growth. And these have been really stimulating conversations. So the economy, absolutely #1 objective. Very closely linked to the economy, of course, is the fiscal position. And all the civil servants in the room will be well aware that the last 3 or 4 years have been tough. These have been years of austerity, they've been years of pay freezes or pay restraint, pension contributions are on the rise. Every part of government has been told by ministers, and rightly so, to hunt out waste and to tackle inefficiency. But despite all of the efforts that have been made over the last 3 years, really tough times for all of us, our fiscal deficit as a percent of GDP is still over 7%, over 7% of GDP. Our debt to GDP ratio is still rising. Debt interest payments are rising. So despite, as I say, the austerity, despite this sort of relentless focus on better value for money and efficiency, which we're all helping with, there is still an enormous way to go in getting that fiscal deficit down to a balanced level and to get the debt GDP ratio falling rather than rising. So we've got 3-4 more years at least of this period of retrenchment to go. We're on track. I think we can pat ourselves on the back for the efficiency improvements that have been made, £10 billion of efficiency improvements last year alone. And I think the spending review, the spending round that we announced last week was a remarkably smooth event in the end. We found another £11.5 billion of public spending savings, and a good chunk of that came from efficiency. But that is a relentless challenge for the government as a whole, and very much something which the civil service is engaged in and is tested by and will be judged by. And then the third element I wanted to highlight is, again, complementary with the first two. It's the reform of public services. Pretty much every single department, as well as having to deal with the cuts and the efficiency drive, is having to think about how public services can be reformed. Literally every single part of Whitehall is involved in some sort of transformation or another. So whether you look at the welfare programme, this morning Cabinet had a discussion about the work programme, the latest figures on the work programme, a fundamental change in the way we try and address the issue of joblessness in this country. At the same time, Ian Duncan-Smith and his civil service team are trying to put in place the universal credit, a dramatically complicated project. Very good progress has been made on that. You've got the single-tier pension, the whole reform of pensions, auto-enrolment, originally conceived by the previous government, brought in by the coalition government. Every part of the welfare budget has been scrutinised for efficiency and for reform. And you could say exactly the same about education. Free schools, a massive expansion in academies, a major reform of the national curriculum, a huge review of the way in which qualifications are established and are monitored, a real drive to increase standards of teaching and of schools in general. And the National Health Service, if we've been here a year ago, it would have been fresh in our minds. What a huge reform programme had been designed for the National Health Service and was going through Parliament and so on. That is now being landed right up and down the country, a vast transformation programme, very much on time, on budget, making big administrative savings, whilst at the same time health outcomes and some of the measures of waiting times and so on are all going in the right direction, all staying solid. Criminal justice system, we've got elected police commissioners, we've got a major radical revolution in probation. Again, tremendous savings being found by the police, and at the same time crime falling. And of course the civil service. We're here to talk about the civil service today. Civil service, I certainly can't remember in my nearly 30-year career a more transformative programme of civil service reform. And we'll be announcing in a couple of weeks' time, hopefully, the progress we've made so far in the last year on the civil service reform programme. And I know Bob Kerslake and Francis Ward will want to say more about that later. So how, as a civil service, are we coping with this? I've only mentioned the sort of three areas: the economy, fiscal policy, public service reform. I could have mentioned another 4 or 5 other areas. But just on those alone, how is the civil service coping with this transformation, these pressures, these demands? Well, we don't say it very often, but I would like to take a minute to congratulate the civil service, if I may, on a job well done so far. We're not at all complacent, but if you look at how we've managed over the last 3 years, there's been at least a 15% headcount reduction in many departments, a much bigger reduction, huge efficiency savings, but yet the outcomes that ministers want to see in the public services and from the civil service have, if anything, improved. By any standards, that is a step change in productivity. It used to be said that in the private sector productivity was herring away, and in the public sector it was stagnant. Well, no one can reasonably make that remark now about the last 3 years. If anything, productivity in the private sector, judged by the numbers the ONS put out, has been stalling, if not falling. In the public sector, and certainly I would argue in the civil service anyway, we've seen a step change. We have the most productive civil service we've ever had. We have the most efficient civil service we've ever had. And I would argue we've probably got the busiest civil service we've ever had. And I think that is due to some tremendous leadership right across the civil service, from permanent secretaries downwards, but particularly, I think, also at sort of middle management level, in local office management level, where you're having to stimulate and motivate staff despite tough pay conditions and a difficult pension reform. You're getting the job done. And I think it's a real tribute to you guys and all your colleagues that we've done so well. But absolutely, we cannot stand still. We have a reform programme that we must deliver. We'll be announcing some further improvements and extensions to that reform programme in the coming weeks once Cabinet has had a chance to look at it. But I already think that the reforms that we've been putting in place not just at the centre, in the Cabinet Office, driven brilliantly by Francis Ward and the team there, but right across Whitehall, where every permanent secretary is leading a transformation programme. Those changes are already making a big difference. And there's many ways of different ways of cutting it, but for simplicity, I just bring out three big themes. This is the way I think about the Civil Service Reform Programme. First, we're trying to make the civil service more open. Second, we're trying to make the civil service more unified. And third, we're trying to make the civil service more skilled. So what do I mean by a more open civil service? I mean by a more open civil service, a confident civil service which is not afraid of competition, not afraid of contestability, not afraid to consider new ideas, welcomes challenge. And I mean that in relation to the way that services are delivered up and down the country, where we should certainly be open to some of these ideas about creating mutuals out of cost centres and allowing civil servants to form themselves up into social enterprises. We should be embracing new styles of contracting like payment by results, where we're paying the private sector or charities to deliver services on a risk basis, where they only get paid if they deliver actual results. And of course, we continue to do many services brilliantly in-house, just as well as they can be done anywhere else. So on the delivery of services side, but also the delivery of policy advice, we've got to be open to new ideas. We're going to be doing some very interesting work, I think, in one of the hubs later on some of the new techniques, the nudge techniques, the use of transparency, the use of partnerships with the private sector. I've mentioned payment by results already, the work programme, a very good example of that. We need to be absolutely embracing these new ideas and be at the cutting edge. When I meet fellow cabinet secretaries from around the world, it's genuinely a matter of pride to me how many of these good ideas that are catching on around the world have come from the UK. And that's because the civil service has always been open to those ideas. And just as we were with privatisation and private finance, so now with social impact bonds and nudge and so on, we are literally at the cutting edge globally. That's where we need to be. So open, confident, very happy to be personally accountable for our decisions. The flip side of openness is accountability. Parliament's demanding more accountability from the civil service. Well, I think we should be willing to embrace that agenda. We have nothing to be ashamed of, everything to be proud of. Unified. Unified, I think, means different things to different people. To me, it means a couple of things that are really important. It means trying to get away from the silo mentality of individual departments doing their own thing and then pushing it up the silos to their ministers and then getting ministers to debate. We need much more lateral communication, horizontal working, cross-departmental working, not requiring ministers to sort everything out politically, but working across departmental boundaries. It's an age-old agenda. We haven't yet found the perfect solution to this, but I think compelled by tight budgets, by shrinking administration budgets and shrinking headcounts, we need to be much, much better at trying to find cross-departmental working. And secondly, in similar vein, it means more sharing of services, sharing of back-office services. Even if ministers want to keep the same number of departments and ministers as we've got now, behind the brass plates, if you like, a lot more sharing can be going on of all the non-specialist functions. It just doesn't make sense to have 20 or 30 different IT departments and so on. We've made a huge progress in the last year on this agenda. We're going to need to go a lot further, in my view, over the next 3 or 4 years as we carry on that fiscal retrenchment. And then the skills agenda. We've been very clear about this. We don't want to lose any of the traditional policy-making skills, what used to be called generalists. They're actually very skilled professionals. We call them generalists. We don't want to lose those. But at the same time, we've got to be much better in the right areas, not everywhere, but in the right areas, at project management, at commercial negotiation with the private sector, and in becoming a much more digital world, with a much more digitally enabled civil service. So we've prioritised these areas. We've got a capability plan which sets all this out. We've now got to make a reality of that capability plan. It's all very well writing a document. It's quite another thing applying that document in the real world so that actual civil servants' careers change as a result of what they're being guided to by the capability plan. And again, I think we're making big progress on this. We don't shout about it enough. The major projects, it's going to be a long time before every single major project in the UK public sector is on time and on budget, but my goodness, we're making real progress. I asked for the figures only a few days ago. I was told at the start of this Parliament, only about 28% of the major projects that they oversaw, that's most of the major projects in Whitehall, only 28% of those were on track. Now the number is closer to 2/3, and we're on track to get that much closer to 100% by the end of this Parliament. That may sound as though there's still a glass, half empty, But I don't believe that the public sector is any worse than the private sector on this to start with. And if we can get to a position where 2/3 and eventually as near as damn it 100% of our projects are on time and on budget, that will be a tremendous achievement. It's something we can look back on with real pride. And we're doing that through a combination of training up the senior responsible officers in charge of the projects. We're reducing the amount of turnover so people don't leave the projects to get promoted. We're introducing a pivotal role allowance. We're just putting a lot more management attention on this, and that just shows you what can be done. And on the digital side as well, some of you will have heard Mike Bracken, I hope, earlier. The GDS, as a really professional part of the Cabinet Office, is now driving transformational change across. And we've got 25 separate flagship digital transformation projects across Whitehall. And if we can deliver all those, as I believe we can, by 2015, the civil service will look a completely different place. And literally every member of the population of the country will notice the difference. So I think we can be very proud of the achievements we've made already, the progress we've already made on the skills side of the budget, on the steps we've taken on shared services, on the unified side, and I think the culture of openness that we're embracing. Open, unified, skilled to deliver some of the toughest challenges the country's faced in many, many years. So what does all this amount to? And I'll stop at this point so we can get some chance to have some questions. The Prime Minister talks a lot about Britain winning the global race. As we come out of recession, we're competing not just against the United States, Germany and major developed countries, we're competing against China, India, Brazil, these major emerging economies who have fewer constraints in many respects in the way that they drive economic performance. We're in that global race. And I'm absolutely clear we can't win or come close to winning that global race without a world-class civil service. That's what we're absolutely committed to. I think we're already at the sort of cutting edge in many respects. We've got to continue to iron out the weaknesses and address those in a very forensic and demanding way. We've got to be very demanding of ourselves. But we can win the global race as a country, and we can do so with a world-class civil service. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Some questions. Perhaps I'll just kick off with the fact that Mark Carney joined the Bank of England yesterday on his first day,
yep.
And apparently had a dinner. I don't know if you were at it last night with the Chancellor. But I mean, what do you think in terms of him coming to the Bank of England at this stage? What's your view of how that relationship will need to develop and go further?
Well, I think it's probably quite a good time to join, actually, according to the economic numbers we read in today's newspapers. Look, I mean, I think the most important thing to say about Mark Carney is I think most people regard him as the world's most impressive central banker. And we've shown the confidence as a country and the pulling power as a country to attract that person to come and work in Britain. And I think that there are not many countries in the world who would have had the self-confidence and be at ease with themselves enough to have a foreigner coming to work in such an important symbol of the country, as it were, as their central bank. We've made that decision, and I think we're all looking forward to seeing how Mark Carney gets on. We'll give him whatever support he needs. It's a vital institution for Britain. It's even more vital now it's got control of banking supervision again. So that's a really important appointment, and the government will give him and the bank our full support.
Thank you. Open this up to questions now from the floor.
Yeah.
Lady down here and a gentleman here. Perhaps like to just introduce yourself and let us know where you're from. That would be really helpful.
The name's Pauline Wallace and I'm from the MOD. It's a question generally. Thank you very much for the praise that you gave us. I think as civil servants we appreciate it because I do find at times that we are grossly undervalued. But with this era of the papers, actually you read different papers, different days, decrying the civil service so much. Why isn't the government rising in as much force as the papers to defend us?
It's a difficult one because obviously we make this point all the time to our ministers, and they very rightly say in return that they do make speeches and do make statements in Parliament supporting the civil service. And I know all the ministers I talk to are full of praise for the civil service. Of course they say we'd like this to be better and that to be better as well. So it's not a complacent, bland critique. But the papers will just report what they think their readers will find interesting. And At the moment, they find it quite an interesting critique to point out the weaknesses of the civil service and occasionally some tensions between what ministers might want and what civil servants might be offering. I personally don't think it reflects at all the quality of the civil service or the relationship between ministers and the civil service, which I think is absolutely in good shape. But I agree, it is painful to pick up the newspaper and see us being attacked. We do our very best to rebut that. I'm afraid sometimes that the more positive messages just aren't carried. And that's just life, unfortunately. I think we just have to, in a sense, dust ourselves down and get on and try and deliver for the country.
Thank you. There's a gentleman down here.
And who's that gentleman? Civil Service World.
As I say, I think there are some journalists in the audience who can perhaps report some of the good things as well as the bad.
We try our best to report what the civil service does well. Matt Ross, the Civil Service World, of course. There's an interesting bit in the infrastructure plan, which appeared that followed up something Lord Dayton said previously about bringing in private sector people to manage major projects. How does that sit alongside the desire to train up civil servants and the major projects authority? Won't it suggest to civil servants, actually, that might be a bit of a dead end if we're bringing in interims to do the job instead?
I don't think so, no. I don't think there's any real conflict at all. I mean, clearly, in the short term, it's going to take some time to grow our own in all of these areas. And I think it's absolutely something we've always done as a civil service, which is try and bring people in from outside who've got specialist skills in areas we lack skills. That's a great thing to do. I'm actually in favour of people coming in from outside, and I'm very much in favour of civil servants going outside to learn as well. I did that myself. So more interchange, more people in from the private sector, more civil servants going out to pick up experiences from outside. That's all perfectly sensible, very necessary. It's great having experts from outside coming into the civil service because they can help grow the new generation coming up. And I don't see any real contradiction between the two. Now, even when we've got plenty of our own good project managers, and we need literally hundreds because we've got so many projects, it will still make sense to test the best in the civil service against competition from outside. I mean, I believe in competition, and I think, I absolutely believe in a full service career, as it were, when people join the civil service and stay for 20, 30 years. But equally, I believe in having some ventilation, so we bring in some new people from outside at the top of the civil service and make sure we've got a blend of skills. I think it's vital that we do that. We need, we are doing really important work for the country, and we can't just become a sort of closed monopoly, and we never test ourselves against best outside thinking or best outside people. We need to be an open, confident organisation.
The other thing we're doing is building more networks, both internally to encourage people to have a professional network of support and also externally.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really powerful thing as well, of kind of sharing the best practice more around the service so that we do become more unified and we learn both from our successes and our failures more quickly. Are there any more questions? So it's a little hard for us to see. Lots on this side, Gary. And Will. Some people down here. I can see a lady in a white jacket. Getting a sense of what the question time session is going to be like later on. Thank you very much. And there's also one further down here too.
Hello, my name's Erica Hurrigan. I work for the Carers Allowance Unit for the Department for Work and Pensions. You mentioned right at the end about a world-class civil service.
Yeah.
And in our department, we have a less than world-class IT system, which causes huge frustrations and inefficiency because of problems with it. Do you see us ever having a world-class IT system to support a world-class civil service?
It's putting you on the spot.
Yeah, I think we've got to be honest with ourselves that of the various promises we made in last year's civil service plan, some have gone more slowly than others. And one of the ones that's gone most slowly, in fact hasn't really gone anywhere at all, is a modern workplace. And you're absolutely right. As very much part of the sort of prioritisation for the next year, we've got to give that more attention, both the sort of physical workspace, but also, above all, the IT. So I completely agree. Obviously, these things cost money, so it's a matter of prioritisation within departments. But there are some enablers that need to be sort of put in place, like a sensible approach to security, a proportionate approach to security, which has got in the way. You are beginning to see in some parts of the civil service now what you might call a sort of modern approach to IT, the sort of approach we've all got in our homes. And for example, the government digital service. If you go and visit the government digital service, that will look as though it's basically, you're at home. The quality of the IT. So the question is, how do we spread pockets of good practice, normal practice, to the rest of the civil service? That will take time, but it's definitely going to get more attention in the next year than it's had in the last, because I completely agree with you.
David Elston, Ministry of Justice. I noticed in your opening speech that you've got a growth agenda sort of objective within your objectives for the next 2 years.
Yeah.
Isn't that about 4 years too late? Shouldn't we have had a growth agenda when the government came in, investing in infrastructure, investing in roads, transport, airports and everything, which would have got the economy moving, and therefore we'd be in a much better place now than we are at this point in time?
Well, I didn't actually say the government has only had a growth agenda from this year onwards. I said permanent secretaries have had a specific growth objective from actually last year and this year. I think the government would argue that it has had a growth agenda from day one, part of which, of course, is getting the fiscal position under control, long-term interest rates down, and so on. But right from the word go, they've also been focused on supply-side reform and so on. But it says I don't really want to get into a debate about government policy. The point I was making was that permanent secretaries have now got a specific growth objective, even if they're in what you might call a traditionally non-growth department. So the MOJ has not really seen itself in previous years as a growth department. But actually, if you peel away, there's lots of stuff the MOJ can help with: reform of judicial review or judicial review delays, sponsorship of a tremendously successful UK legal industry, one of our biggest exporting industries, and so on. Each individual department, as it starts to think about what contribution it can make, gets quite a long way in giving focus on things which it hadn't previously thought about really as what it was responsible for. That's different from the overall government strategy, which I think from day one they would say they've had a growth strategy.
Happy if we take one more question and then we'll wrap this session up. There's just one over here. Thank you, sir.
Thanks. Raj here, Department for Education. I was really interested to hear you talking about policy making and open policy, contestable policy, and innovation in that field. The question I've been sort of thinking about is when we're looking at working more broadly and introducing, say, competition with others in the field, for instance, where we're thinking about maybe using, for instance, think tanks and other thinkers to actually support us in our policy making. What does that mean for kind of independent and impartial advice? I mean, is there a shift that's going on there? And is that something we need to be kind of thinking about as well?
Well, it's definitely an important factor we've got to build in as we think about how we can bring contestability and competition to policy making. In a way, it's one of the civil service's strongest calling cards, that anybody outside, people will always raise questions about whether the people they're funding them or they themselves have a vested interest and so on. Whereas I hope people accept, after many decades of proof, that the civil service has integrity, has values and impartiality and so on, and we're never going to compromise those. So it's a calling card for the civil service to continue to maintain that position. But I think beyond that, we've also got to make sure to protect ministers from making bad decisions, as it were, that if and when advice is sought from outside the civil service, we put in place a framework to ensure that when decisions get taken, as opposed to advice being provided, a proper objectivity is brought to bear. But I don't think we should just hide behind this to say that there can therefore never be any competing policy advice. I think we need to embrace the concept and work out how it can be made to work in a world in which ministers get best advice, which is freed from any taint of potential or perceived conflicts of interest. It can be done, but it does need careful thought.
Thank you. I'm going to draw this session to a close with my personal takeaways from it. The first is, I think, that we should celebrate our success more and be proud of all that we are currently doing. And the second is from the lady who talked about the IT and the fact that if I take something personal from this and I'll go and do a pledge on the wall, it is really to work harder on the delivery of modern workplaces over the next year. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you very much for a lively session. Thank you all.
Thank you.